This is Food Safety First with your host, Ryan Ramdass.
Thank you for tuning in and welcome to episode 1 of Food Safety First podcast. Our mission with this podcast is to take topics and frequently asked questions and have a conversation with industry experts. In today's episode, we'll discuss food safety programs with none other than the president of Fortress Technology, Steve Gidman. Hey Steve, thanks for joining us and being part of our first ever show.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
Now, this has been here in the works for a while. We've been brainstorming about having a podcast, and really where it comes from is we want to talk about food safety. And we have a lot of customers and feedback and input, and we figure, you know what, instead of having a FAQ on our website, fortresstechnology.com, we'll actually just do like a podcast and have a discussion, have a conversation. So, Steve, tell me, how long have you been involved in the food safety industry?
I'd rather not say, but a number of decades. Certainly long enough to have seen a complete shift in the industry from, in the most cases, decades ago, a pretty lackadaisical attitude to today where you see an extreme focus on food safety from the smallest companies to the biggest.
Okay, well, see, I haven't really been involved in food safety, but I guess I've had food all my life. So from a consumer perspective, I feel that food safety is kind of implied. It's forgotten. Like you buy a bag of chips, you blindly go in, you're looking for chips. You open cereal, you're looking for cereal, you expect cereal. When you find a contaminant that you're not expecting, it's alarming, it's escalating, and it's devastating to the customers. And I guess food safety programs is what's happening in the background that consumers don't know about.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from a consumer's point of view, they'd probably rather not know about it, but and take it for granted. I think that's a sign of the health of our food programs, especially in Europe and North America, where we've had a long history of at least some attention to food safety. I think historically there's been a much bigger focus on controlling pathogens, which of course represent extreme danger potentially to humans. But it's now encompassed everything that touches the food. Contamination is certainly our area of expertise, but it has expanded to look at all aspects of food safety. And really, yeah, the fact that you take it for granted is a great sign that basically it's working.
Okay, interesting. Now, I have a figure here it's a 2016 study from the Association of Packaging Processing Technologies, Brand Protection, and Product Traceability. It states that the average cost for a recall for the food company is about $10 million. That's direct costs, business interruption, brand damage, lost sales. I guess with today's social media and their urge for 24-hour news reporting, any contamination, whether it's verified or not, could become national headlines in an instant.
Yeah, the cost is extremely high, obviously, and I'd probably put that on the low side.
Really?
Yeah, I think quite often when you look at the total cost, I don't know how they estimate brand damage because that would be the biggest one, but it's an expensive adventure that nobody wants to go down through that path. But it's the fact that the system is there, as the recall system is there, also is there for good reason. It does work. Of course, everybody wants to avoid it, and the best way to avoid it is doing absolutely best practice on every aspect of food safety, which is now quite firmly affixed in legislation, not just in as it was previously, driven by larger food companies who recognize the brand damage in the past and somewhat by the retailers. But today, as you mentioned, it isn't just retailer pressure, it isn't just legislation, but the actual public is so directly involved with any event of the slightest nature. It becomes viral,
Right.
to coin the phrase, instantaneously. This is across the globe. And that really hurts. That really hurts the food manufacturer. And sometimes it's not even their fault. It turns out to be a post production sabotage or other claims. But almost invariably results in a recall anyway, although nobody reads about that part.
Right.
They just hear the bad news, not the fact that it turned out to be something else entirely.
Well, I guess that leads us in today's topic, food safety programs. Businesses are doing something in the background to safeguard consumers. In a nutshell, can you give us an overview exactly what is a food safety program?
Yeah, it would be basically any program that's designed to improve the safety and health of the food system as a whole, and certainly for any specific customer. Basically, everything that they do, what kind of food do they make, how they make it, straight from coming from historically from when it comes into their plant to when it goes out, has been part of their food safety program. And now we're seeing, of course, that's even extended further from beyond their factory door where it's coming in. That's actually, we're going now to looking at where it's coming from, what farm it's coming from, what area it's coming from. So the traceability of, if there are issues, where did it occur? And we need to go straight back to the source to find it. But generally, a food safety program is anything that's going to ensure the safety of food, either from pathogens, contamination, anything that can actually get into food and cause damage to people.
Okay, fair enough. Now, you said you've been doing this for decades. Have you seen food safety programs make a big impact to the industry?
Yes, for sure, because certainly going back to the 70s, where I was actually involved still, this kind of attention to food safety from start to finish really was the domain of fairly large companies. I think they could see the risks that are involved to them for a large brand. I won't name any brands, but we all sort of know those household names that they recognize these risks before there was any kind of force or pressure from supermarkets or from legislative sources. And we're the early adopters of food safety programs and borrowed from, I believe, the military started with HACCP for their military food sources. And that was basically borrowing that and starting to bring that kind of mindset into food production. And it made, once that started to sort of grab hold and then other people adopted HACCP principles, you could see a significant shift in the way plants operated in the attention to detail, the attention to control, and from our point of view, contaminant detection, the profile raised significantly. Whereas in the old days, people either didn't bother with this kind of equipment to sense for contaminants, or it was a pretty low profile piece of equipment. But today, that would actually, a non-working contaminant detection system would basically stop the line, and in some cases bring the plant to a stop. And they have the power to do that. And then 20 years ago, that was rare.
Okay. You keep mentioning contaminants. What exactly is a contaminant? Can you break that down?
Well, I guess anything that a consumer finds in their food that they don't think should belong there. And that's very wide-ranging. And from the research that I've been involved with, done by big food companies, the biggest contaminant complaint are things like shells, stalks, pits, things that are generally part of the food. So while nobody wants to have a shell, perhaps in their product, it isn't at least a naturally occurring part of the food, so it's not as sort of intimidating as something else. The second biggest one is insects. It's part of the food system, unfortunately, and so insects is nobody wants to find a bug in their food, and it's never an enjoyable experience. The third would be the sort of dangerous contaminants, so things like metal, glass, rock, all of those things that could actually potentially hurt a person if they're in the product, and can also show up as very fine, fairly small particles, but can do some actual serious harm to people.
But where's the metal coming from?
Yeah, of all those contaminants, metal is the most commonly used in a food plant. So the actual plant itself is entirely, all the equipment, all the mixers, dicers, slicers, they're all made of metal, generally stainless steel, but not necessarily so. And then even if you go upstream, you've got just the farm tractor parts, everything. And if a farmer harvests a field of grain, you have somebody's thrown a pop can in there, and that pop can ends up in the food system, unfortunately. So metal is by far the most common contaminant that is detectable with today's technology on a very reliable basis. Glass and so forth, it's there. It's not part of the machinery. It's not typically even part of a food plant. If you go to a food plant, glass is very tightly controlled or non-existent. And some of the other contaminants, again, rock you get from the field comes in with the grain or the harvest or whatever. It can follow the whole system all the way through. But it's occurring, and it can't be helped. And metal, of course, is everywhere in a food plant. So it's continuously being contributed by not just from the farm, but from the machinery that does all the handling.
Okay, so we're talking about the manufacturers having programs to safeguard, but really their customers would be the retailers. Are retailer requirements changing? Are they having an impact to food safety standards?
Yeah, it's really changed since I've been involved, especially in the North American market, but in Europe also, where the retailers never really took part in the food safety systems, really, although it's a bit of a surprise when you think about it from today's perspective. But certainly in the UK, in early days, I think you started to see some very powerful muscle being flexed by people like Marks and Spencer's, who very early days recognized that product being bought at their stores, if there's issues, it reflected poorly on them, and therefore they really looked at what standards they needed to have their providers of product living up to, and that really snowballed. It did take some time, believe it or not. That was from the 70s till probably the 90s before you started to see other big retailers get involved with having a specification, requirements, a whole list of things, and now doing their own audit visits to their suppliers. So if you want to get product onto the shelf of a major supermarket, most likely you will have gone through a number of hurdles, which will include having contaminant detection, pathogen control, a whole HACCP system, which they will come in and review and make sure that what you've got in place is robust, that you're living by it, not just writing it down. And they'll do this on a fairly regular basis. And it really, again, significantly has changed, that pressure has changed the way the food industry responds.
Okay, you've mentioned this before, and it's probably a topic for another show or our next episode. But HACCP, what exactly is HACCP?
Well, HACCP is an acronym for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. And again, it goes, I believe, could be wrong, that it goes back to the U.S. military actually using it in their food systems and coming up with a way to analyze, basically means look at every potential hazard in the process from beginning to end, identifying hazards, coming up with a way to measure or control those hazards, and creating these control points. So, and then actually qualifying your control points to see whether you're using the best technology and is it living up to the expectations of what you've put in place for it. So you have to measure that. You have to come up with a way to measure it, and you have to come up with a pass or fail for that. So if you identify all those sequences throughout a food plant, the whole process to packaging, there's hundreds of potential issues that need to be looked at, identified, come up with a way to measure. If it's pathogens, you may be taking swabs. You may be making sure that the temperature of a freezer or even an oven or so forth, whatever you're using to look at pathogen control, that you're measuring these devices, and in our case, metal detection or contaminant detection systems, that if you have them in place, that you are testing them, you're certifying that they are built for purpose, that they're up to date, and that you're regularly testing them to confirm that they're operating to the specifications that you've established. That's really HACCP in a nutshell. Virtually the entire food system, and certainly most parts of the world, is on board with adopting that. Through the U.S. Regulations now with the Food Safety Modernization Act, there's a bigger focus on prevention rather than just analyzing for hazard. You're looking for actually, and then controlling it. You're actually now focusing, and it's really just almost a turn of words, but it just changes the focus to prevention rather than catching it like a policeman at the end of the line.
Okay, that makes sense.
You're looking at proposing what could happen and how do you prevent it in the first place rather than just relying on catching it after it's happened. And that's the HARPC or HARPC version of HACCP. So it's HACCP with an addition of focus of prevention.
Actually, Steve, so you mentioned Food Safety Modernization Act, the FSMA, and I guess there's a whole alphabet soup out there: FDA, SFQ, BRC. I guess with globalization, the world is shrinking. Is there more of a global standard towards food safety?
Yeah, I think most of these legislative concepts are very much merging into things that look very similar. Certainly the U.S. Instituted their own act, but if you look at it, it's very, very similar to SQF and so forth. It's borrowed from all of the best practices, probably stepped it up in a little way, and certainly making it legislative and giving it power has been the big thing.
Cool, interesting. I want to thank you for being part of our inaugural episode 1. It was a pleasure to pick your brain, and I know I've learned a lot.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
All right, thank you for listening, everybody. Tune in next time when we take a deeper dive into food safety first.